Great. Well, good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's webinar, which is being run by the Campaign for Social Science. The campaign demonstrates how social science improves public policy, society, and our lives, and it highlights the value of applied social science research and advocates for its greater use in decision-making and in government. I'm Matthew Niblett. I'm Director of the ITC, the Independent Transport Commission, and I'll be chairing today's webinar. A link should appear shortly in the chat box to the campaign's website, where you can find reports, evidence-based articles, as well as event recordings, and also see details of what's coming up in the months ahead. Today, we will be focusing on bridging the gap between research evidence on transport policy and political and public action. Campaign's chosen topic today is that there is research evidence that reducing car travel can deliver benefits to the climate and to public health. But there is major public and political caution and skepticism about this. During this webinar, our panel will be discussing questions such as how politicians can understand and shape public opinion in order to deliver potential carbon, health, and social benefits that arise from reduced car use. And they'll be exploring what might need to happen at a population and also at an individual level. We have an excellent panel assembled today from across the United Kingdom. We're going to hear from Professor Charles Musselwhite, Dr. Siobhan Campbell, and Professor Iain Docherty, who will each give a presentation outlining their research and their findings before we open up for a question and answer with you, with the aim of developing by the end of the webinar some specific policy recommendations. Say a little bit more about our expert panel today. Professor Charles Musselwhite is Professor of Psychology and Co-Director of the Research Centre for Transport and Mobility at Aberystwyth University. His research involves applying social, environmental, and health psychology to understanding and improving relationships between the built environment and transportation and health, and he's now a Fellow of the Academy. Dr. Siobhan Campbell is Chief Strategy and Commercial Officer at the National Manufacturing Institute of Scotland, and her experience spans a career as a civil servant for 23 years, as well as her more recent work in the private sector. She has a particular interest in monitoring and evaluation of a government policy, supporting, progressing, and implementing innovation, as well as the social technical space where technology and people must come together in order to achieve successful outcomes. Professor Iain Docherty is Dean of the Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of Stirling. And prior to this, he was Professor of Public Policy and Governance and Director of External Engagement at the University of Glasgow Adam Smith Business School. His research interests focus on the interconnecting issues of public policy, institutional change, and city and regional competitiveness, especially the role of transport in promoting economic development and environmental sustainability. Before I hand over to the panelists, I remind you that you can submit your questions through the Q&A function box. We will all be able to see the questions you submit, and we'll try to cover as broad a cross-section of them as we can in the Q&A session following the presentations. With that introduction over, I'm now very pleased to hand over to Charles for his talk.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm going to give, being an academic, of course, a presentation. Let me share my slides. Hopefully you can all see that really well. There you go. So yeah, delighted to be here. It's my first full day as being a Fellow of the Academy, so I've got to do the Academy proud today. And really, I've just got a really simple message to deliver in my 10-minute outline talk here at the start. And that's really that transport is social. Transport is about people at the end of the day. That might seem simple. It might seem like something that we kind of all understand and take for granted. But I think there's so many situations and so many incidences where people are excluded from the transport system, if you want, from the decision makers to the delivery to the users at the end of the day. And we just need to put people a bit more central in the decision making process. So our current approach at the moment we haven't really moved on very much from those classic illustrations that you get in Traffic in Towns, Colin Buchanan's book from back in the day. Transport is still a system that fits really neatly into current domains such as neoliberalism, positivism, and it's a very technocratic process at the end of the day. That has huge implications for how we deliver interventions on transport and how the users end up having to use the transport at the end of the day. So what do I mean by neoliberalism? It's that idea that choice is first and foremost and center to what we do. It's about hyper individuality. It's about creating private space. It's about fueling finance so that finance goes round and round. And really, it ends up with the fact that as an implication of those kind of things, that only the dominant voices get heard. We're not very good at disaggregating stuff in transport. So if you're one of the loud voices using the transport system, you get your needs seen to at the end of the day. And of course, there's different elements of power within all of that. So at the end of the day, that means only some people get to choose. Some people have more power to choose the system and what it looks like. And underpinning all of that is our accountability to the people who pay for these decision makings. But it's also about things, like I said, the positivist approach, about seeking truth, about over-reliance on proof, about defending the decision-making we make. So we over-rely on tools, on models, on quantitative data. And we kind of think that the technology will solve any of the side effects or any of the problems, but we don't even conceive those side effects of the system particularly very well. And those side effects we have at the moment are things like the effects of transport system on planetary health, the negative effects on individual health, and just on the planet in general. And generally, as a result of all of these concepts that glue poorly together, I think, the everyday user, if you like, the people at the center of it all, are generally thought of as a nuisance, something that you just need to get rid of in the system. They don't behave themselves properly when they're put into the models. They cause lots of trouble and issues around the edge. Why don't they just behave themselves? But it's really because we don't conceptualize people very well. So yeah, people are a nuisance. They don't behave like the models tell them to do at the end of the day. And I think that's really, though, that we haven't got the humans and the models in the system. And when they are, they're aggregated at such an overarching level that a lot of assumptions are made on the way humans behave within the transport system, that in fact, very few people probably behave like that at the end of the day. There's been an overemphasis for years on the models used in decision-making in transport, about the fact that people mostly move into urban and they move 9 to 5 work. Well, that couldn't be further from the truth in most areas these days, and how transport has changed and the way people work, the reasons for using transport has changed. We really miss the outliers as a result. We miss the people who don't or can't travel. We miss, I do lots of work on the aging population. So I want to get that right for when I retire. It's always a vested interest in things, but we miss out lots of the older people's journeys that are very different to the rest of the population. They might be not working or working part-time. They have different reasons for travel. And yeah, we miss out on the 22% of households without access to a car. The dominant voice in transport is still coming from vehicles and car use at the end of the day. It means we're missing out on people who are already marginalized in one way or another. Not only are they excluded from the transport, they're excluded from having good health, they're excluded socially as well, and they all interlink to make that an area that's missing out. So what happens is that you miss out really on understanding what people do at the end of the day. People don't make decisions on their transport, well, rationally, particularly if you don't look at why those decisions are being made in the first place. And you end up with people making decisions on all sorts of things that we don't take into account. And that irrationality is shown in psychology terms, with over 200 different cognitive biases that impact on our judgment to make a correct decision. And that affects, of course, the decision makers in transport, but it also affects the user at the end of the day. But we assume at the other side of this that the models we have are good and high quality, and we use them as justification for planning and building our travel and transport systems and delivering our interventions. But as O'Connell says over there, I think we've really missed the boat in not understanding the social context within transports delivered. And just as a couple of examples of that, moving on. Ian Walker, Alan Tapp, and Adrian Davis's excellent paper recently just shows how what they've called motor normativity, or I've coined before institutional carism, means that the norms in society are always swayed against those not using a car. Cars have a special privilege and drivers have a special privilege in life. They carried out a study where they just asked a simple question about whether things should happen in the public domain or not, and they swapped car use with a non-car use control. And in all cases, cars have a special privilege. People shouldn't drive in highly populated areas where other people have to breathe in the car fumes, for example. It's seen a lot less negatively than somebody driving, somebody smoking in it. So cars are seen much more less negatively in an area where they give out fumes than cigarette smoking, for example. And the same with a number of different areas in that. Cars are held in a slightly different prestigious place. In research I've done, and I carry out this exercise every year with students of mine, you can see how these cultural norms are dominated in society by the things that we do in everyday life, by our cultural life. We're much more likely to write movies about cars. We're much more likely to write books about cars. We're much more likely to upload videos on YouTube about cars compared to any other mode of transport. And that's a reflection of just how dominant cars are in society. Again, interestingly, we're more likely to sing about walking than we are cars. And if we had a bit more time, I'd ask you all to stick in there some songs about different modes of transport and see what comes up. Interestingly, bicycle finishes last in almost all categories, even worse than the kind of control or default that I've put in there, rocket use, which comes up higher than cycling in songs and in movies and things like that. It's just that cultural dominance that cars have again. And so some of the work that we need to do is about disrupting those cultural and societal norms. So how do we do that? We find it very difficult to do that. My research started very much 15 years ago or so in the middle of that diagram, looking at people who give up driving and the difficulty of that in later life, how that affects people's mental well-being, how that affects something about their identity and who they are. And even short-term disruptions cause issues and trouble. So the study that I've put at the top there that we did with people who broke their arm or their wrist and had to have it in a plaster cast, and we even found within that 18% of people continue to drive their car with their arm in a plaster cast, despite the fact that might be really dangerous. Some people even changed their vehicle to an automatic so that they could carry on driving if their left-hand wrist was injured and they couldn't change gears, for example. But the 82% who did change really, I'd say well over half of them moved to a bus. And well over half of those really enjoyed using the bus for the first time, but they all couldn't wait to get back into the car. And that has an important element that, you can disrupt these norms and you can try and change things. But if you don't lock it in somehow, people go back to what they were doing before. Of course, if you give up driving in later life for one reason, you might not be able to do that. But there is hope here, because some research that I've been involved with recently with Luke Robertshaw in Newcastle looked at temporary disruption of bus services. And in fact, some of the bus users there experienced the same problems of health and well-being impacts when they couldn't use their bus as somebody using the car. So perhaps the car isn't privileged. Perhaps we need to change the way we view these things and move away from seeing car as the issue to mobility being the issue. And therefore, we can help people change their mobility to other modes. It's still important to be mobile, but it might not be as important just to use the car. And the biggest disruption we've had recently, of course, is coronavirus. And you can see on that made a huge difference to people's lives and, of course, to the fact that they use transport very differently. And it meant we could use spaces really differently. This is Castle Street in Cardiff. On the left-hand side, the beautiful change that was made as a result of bringing cafes out into the road space. But within 6 months, that was changed back onto the right-hand side of that picture for cars to use again, despite the fact that it was really well used on the left-hand side. And people couldn't wait to get it back to what it was before, which is nowhere near as attractive or different, just showing how difficult it is to break those societal norms. And related to all that, just before I finish, is the fact that people therefore become stuck in these little silos as a result of where they're working. There's disconnect between the professionals. The road safety people don't talk to the planners. The health professionals don't talk to the transport and road safety people. Public health professionals don't speak to those places. Some of the projects I've tried to do is to bring those groups of people together in order that they can have a space and a resource to talk together. They're often got the same needs and issues, or at least they could do, because without it, it means we're trying to solve a planetary health issue like sustainability or issues from climate change without taking into account human health or even animal health, as one health approach might suggest. So you got to train and educate people together in order to make this kind of difference. We can't do it in one sector alone. We can't do it in one discipline alone. So there's got to be better integration of the social, and in particular the social science, with the science. And how do we do that when we've got these competing philosophies? We have to start right at the start with the training and education. So really, in summing up, remember, transport is about people. You've got to have space to bring people together, which is interesting because that's what mobility is often about. But we don't do it very well in terms of the professional or the boundaries between the professional and the user at the end of the day. It's got to be more involvement of people within that, whether that's community being involved in co-producing or co-designing their transport solutions, whether it's just better understanding or better working between public and professional people at the end of the day. So that multidisciplinary, multi-sectorial workforce, and change the norms. You've got to look for breaks in the system, whether that's societal, individual, whether it's life stages, whether it's health-based, but there's got to be a change from looking as car as the dominant force in society to mobility as a whole being the norm that we gather to. And I think there's evidence that we could move that discussion across the border from car to mobility as a whole. And we just need better data tools and models to enhance that human behavior and bring it together. But really, at the end of the day, people are the important thing in transport. And so just to use a quote that's often used by the engineers and the scientists I work with, and we've got to add the social scientist the element to this. Scientists discover the world as it is, and we're always reminded that engineers develop a world that never was. But if we don't have social scientists, we don't know what kind of world we really want to develop at the end of the day. So that's where we come in, and that's where we need to have a higher dominance and a higher power in transport decision making. And that's where I finish. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Charles, for that look at the problems we face in transport policy making. I'm now pleased to hand over to Siobhan for her talk.
Hello, and thank you very much for that, Charles, actually, because mine feeds directly onto that. So I've got no slides for you. You're going to have to look at me and listen to me. But what I'm going to talk about is a paper actually that was published just last week from my old work, which was WSP, around that intersection between green transport, so getting people out of the cars towards more public transport, more active transport, and inclusivity, in particular women's safety. So there's a really interesting angle in all of this, looking through a kind of gender responsive or looking through a gendered lens and having and embracing a more gendered responsive design to increase mobility choices and thereby accelerating this transport decarbonisation journey that we need to get on. And this links really well with the incoming government. I've got much more of a policy bent than the other two speakers here. But Louise Hay, the new Transport Secretary in the UK, has talked about growth, net zero, opportunity, women and girls' safety and health, and how all of them are critical, or critically rely on transport as a key enabler. So what is the issue here? And the key is, exactly as Charles was saying, what are we trying to solve here, and what are the ways that we can do it? And the only way to do that is to really look through the eyes of the transport user, without taking that person-centred perspective, we're not going to get to a place where we can achieve the really quite fundamental change that's required in terms of our transport system. If you're talking about the Climate Change Committee have recommended a 9% reduction in car travel and getting people out of their cars using other modes of transport, that's quite profound. And as Charles was saying, there's lots and lots of things that you need to consider to enable that. Looking through a gendered lens, it's absolutely essential to do some systems thinking and consider the full context of people's journeys across these diverse populations and the interrelated factors that impact their decision making and therefore the outcomes. We know that women travel differently. We know that they trip chain. If you look at the data is that there is a typical journey into the town centre for work that women often buck the trend of, because they travel for multiple reasons and they trip chain in that they will tend to do multiple things as part of their journey. They go shopping, they have caring responsibilities, they go to work, they try to do all of this in an efficient way, and therefore they have different routes, not that outskirts the centre route. They're more circular. They're more worried about violence and assault. It's a constant issue, and they make different decisions because of this, and as a result can pay more as well. And so what the answer to this in terms of a kind of policy making perspective is that we need to have more participative methods, which is very similar to what Charles was saying. We need to actually involve in the decision making that will affect them. We need to understand what it is they're doing, why are they doing it, and what the solutions can be. Simply saying that people should get out of the car, use more public transport, use more active transport, really isn't getting at the root of why are people doing this. Until we understand why and bring these communities into the decision making, into that participative decision making, then we won't actually get the accelerated change that we require. So when I say participative methods, I'm talking about actually bringing these people into the decision making process, working with them to improve their awareness of the issue, making sure that they understand kind of why is this a problem, why are we trying to get this happening in the first place, getting them to acknowledge constraints. So kind of what is it why are we making this decision, especially in a local area, in an urban area? You'll have seen the political backlash that can happen for things like low transport neighbourhoods. What is it that's causing this? Actually getting people to understand the issue and the constraints and a collective solution focus, it will help enable this progress. It needs to be informed by research and analysis. Charles talked about data there. And through this, you develop a shared problem space and also a mechanism to tackle the disinformation. When I was working in DFT, one of the studies we did, working in a participative way, had an unexpected side effect in that the people that we were engaging with this decision, again around low carbon and low traffic, the participants became online advocates. They weren't asked to do this. They took on that role because of their engagement, understanding, education, and feeling of agency in the solution. So what we're talking about is co-design, tailoring, buy-in, ownership, getting people to actually kind of come in and be part of the solution. This has two main benefits. One is simply pragmatic. This is more likely to be successful if you're actually bringing people into the decision-making, people that will be affected by these decisions. You're much more likely to be successful because you're not going to get that backlash. But also, the second reason, it's the ethical thing to do. It's the right thing to do. Having policy with communities rather than to communities is a way to make sure that we understand and we're looking through these lenses of people that we might not otherwise have understood the challenges that they face. It's the right thing to do because it will help us understand and respond to that. So looking, again, I said I've got a particular interest in this kind of gender-carbon intersection. Starting with carbon, we know that local and national governments face increasingly pressure to meet ambitious net zero carbon targets, with transport decarbonisation key priority. In the UK, it's the #1 source of carbon emissions. We need to do something about this. Addressing gender equality issues alongside that presents an opportunity to accelerate that pace of change. And addressing gender equality issues can also generate a positive impact for women, girls, gender diverse individuals and communities. Doing this work and doing this analysis, we saw that actually the goal here is exactly the same. Women who feel empowered and enabled to travel can travel in a low carbon way and can travel by public transport. So if you look again, kind of that was through a carbon lens, starting with a woman, gender responsive transport provides safe mobility for everyone. It's a good thing to do. The result is good. Transport is a gateway to economic opportunity, health services, education. You can achieve that. Safe transport enables, as I said, public transport, active transport. And public transport and active transport are key to decarbonisation. So looking at them both together, many of the challenges affecting the safety and mobility of women also limit the adoption of sustainable transport modes. Tackling one will tackle the other. And I think the key thing to maybe leave things on and get on to the kind of discussion is transport designers don't know what they don't know. It's absolutely essential to take a people-centred approach and ensure you're designing with the groups, especially potentially marginalised groups, to ensure you're successfully designing for everyone. Without that, we're not going to achieve the goals that we're after. Women have to balance affordability and safety, and it can restrict their opportunity and access, or it can impact their mental health and well-being if they're having to go ahead with modes that they feel unsafe using. So I'm going to leave it there, but I think it's really crucial, and I think it's a really interesting approach to look at this through a gendered lens and see that there's actually mutual benefit there for both the carbon agenda, getting people out of their cars, and having clean modes of transport while tackling a really vitally important area, and an area that is a priority to this local government.
Thank you very much, Siobhan. Just before I hand over to Iain, just to remind you that please do submit your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Very interested to hear your thoughts and suggestions on reducing car use, how this might be politically achievable. And now I look forward to handing over to Professor Iain Docherty.
Thanks very much, Matthew. Lovely to be with you all this afternoon. I just have a few images in the background, which I'll try to get to work. And apologies in advance if I cough and sneeze my way through the next 10 minutes, given I've got the start of term lurgy. The kids have lovingly walked back in from school, and I thought I'd start with a picture of some school kids, with apologies to any white BMW drivers. I want to take a step back and think about what transport looks like from a wider public policy perspective. And I want to do that to try and put it into the perspective of quite how dysfunctional it is because of the decisions we've made, and therefore we've got to unwind to fix the problems that Siobhan and Charles have identified. And secondly, I want to talk about time. We're now 6 months away from Q4 of 6 weeks, away from Q4 of 2024, and 6 years away from the end of 2030, where we have some milestone decarbonisation targets, which, if anything, are more demanding than the net zero targets we've set ourselves from in the middle of the century. So it's great that we're coming together today to have a conversation about what we might do to make things better, but we have to think very carefully about what we need to do to make things better very quickly. Now, if you look at any of the research that's done about what people regard as the most pressing public policy issues facing the UK, other than some very brief episodes around things like the introduction of the London congestion charge or serious rail accidents like Hatfield in 2000, transport never gets above 1 or 2% in those polls. And also you've got health, housing, and then whatever combination of immigration and other pensions, other public policy debates score much more highly. So other than people that work in the transport sector, most people, either in the public at large or in the professions, never think about transport at all, which is why we end up with that kind of position. That's a school crossing at the primary school. I can see out the window from where I'm currently sitting. And we think that's fine. We think that's normal. So transport, highly, highly, highly dysfunctional. And as Siobhan in particular said, it's dysfunctional in the way that we set it up and who subsidises whom. So it's an area of the economy and society where the young subsidise the old, where women subsidise men, and where the poor subsidise the rich, by and large. And somehow we're content with that because we've got ourselves into that kind of social and societal acceptance of car domination that Charles talked about at the beginning. Now, apart from the fact that, with that picture, something like a quarter of all traffic and a third of congestion is due to the school run, which isn't a very efficient way of organising education, doesn't really do kids any good, probably doesn't do their education any good, certainly exposes them to physical harm, danger, and also to air pollution. We've always justified what we do in terms of transport investment to widen the choice that's available to us as individuals. And again, Charles spoke about this at the beginning, in the reference to the kind of neoliberal order, as it were. But choice is an interesting and pretty contested phrase. So the school run, in large part, comes around because we gave people a choice of state education in many places. Slightly different systems in Scotland and England, but there's our local outcome of that. I mean, you might just about be able to make an argument that says, well, the supply of more transport gives people more choice in terms of education or perhaps work or perhaps access to particular services. But if you look at the overall distribution of car use, you can find some major elements of that overall mobility that give us very little additional choice at all. So in many places in the UK, shopping is the second most important reason why people get into their car. And yet, of course, we still base our transport econometrics on the idea that somehow having a choice of 6 supermarkets within 10 minutes drive is fundamentally better than 4 or 5. And at the same time, the recent history is that we're making things even worse. So over the last 25 years, and it's really interesting that Siobhan talked about the new government, I'm now old enough to have written a book about how the first term Labour government from 1997 failed miserably to deliver just about everything that it had in its original transport white paper that was published in 1998. And I have to say, I fear history is about to repeat itself. So what have we done over the last 25 years? We've made driving a lot cheaper. We've made public transport more expensive. We've made the public transport in particular, the poorest of our fellow citizens rely on, the bus, more expensive, and there's a lot less of it in most places than there used to be. So we've made the inequality problem worse, and we haven't solved the problem of how much our deteriorating public transport network costs us in terms of public subsidy. And as Charles has also said, I could also point out as a militant pedestrian that somehow on the back of COVID, we've managed to make the pedestrian environment worse too, because we've done nothing about the mechanisation of formerly pedestrian spaces that's been brought about by on-demand food delivery and other technologies we've failed to regulate. Then there are these things. This is round the corner from the primary school you saw a moment ago. There's a pedestrian environment that's physically under attack from oversized vehicles. If you were to take a picture of that environment even 5 years ago, you wouldn't have 2 Toyota pickup trucks and a Range Rover. In that photograph, you'd have 3 vehicles that probably between them weighed a ton or a ton and a half less. So not only are we consistently undermining public transport to social and environmental detriment, but because we've made driving cheaper and because we haven't regulated any of the other aspects of what our private vehicles look like beyond the raw engine size and emissions, we've made them bigger, made congestion worse, and made pedestrian and cyclist safety worse. at the same time. So here's some good news. This is the new active travel bridge that opened across the Clyde in Glasgow on Sunday, and it was a fantastic day out because it was beautifully launched with a festival on both sides, and it was amazing to see people out and about walking and cycling. So we can do this if we put our minds to it. But, and again to agree furiously with Charles, fixing the transport problem is not an engineering challenge. We have 99% of the infrastructure that we're going to have in 2030 or 2045, and that we have to be able to deliver net zero and a fairer transport system with. So building new kit is not going to fix things. Transport is a behavioural issue. And given this is a campaign for social science and academy event, it's probably worth pointing out that perhaps that's not surprising, given that something like only 1% of all climate change and net zero funding in the UK and beyond is directed towards social science research and interventions, because over here we still think of these things as a technological problem, when really they're a system or a behavioural problem. And one thing that's possibly unique about transport is not just is it the sector whose emissions profile is struggling the most, is at best static, emissions are probably increasing, but ironically, it's not a kit problem, and we do know how to fix it. So we know from research that something like 25% of all travel has no net impact to the economy. You study what happens to the transport network under conditions of disruption. Lots of examples of this that are quite famous now. Trafalgar Square pedestrianisation, Hammersmith Bridge, some of the flooding and strikes, and other examples that I was involved in doing some research on with colleagues from the University of Leeds about 15 years ago. We know essentially we can do without 25% of our motorised transport to no net detriment. We know we can make vehicles smaller if we want to, because until very recently they were smaller and safer and more efficient, and they still provided the same amount of mobility for people that use them. We also know that we can generate modal shift away from the car if we price things correctly, because there's plenty of empirical evidence that that is possible. And we also know that we can do all of this quickly. So, you know, if you have this conversation with people who are working out how to decarbonise domestic heating, for example, another really problematic sector in the UK, that is a kit problem. We don't know which mix of technologies we're going to use. We don't know how we're physically going to be able to install them in time, partly because we don't know how many skilled people we're going to have available to do them. We do know, however, that paint is cheap and that bus lane is 7 characters long. So, to finish off and to provoke, I hope, some interesting Q&A, I'm assuming that we all believe that climate science is correct. So if we believe what we're told, and we believe the urgency of acting to make sure that we don't breach our climate budget and we keep, not only do we meet our net zero targets, but we meet the emissions profile under the curve, as it were, then we have to change what we're doing in the transport sector, both in an unprecedented way, i.e. at scale, but also unprecedented speed. So we know that we have to do something that we've never done before. We know, because we've researched it for decades now, that carrot and stick or nudge only produces modest gains and at nothing like the speed that we need to meet our targets. And equally, we know that the one policy tool we do really have that would make a difference to this equation quickly, pricing, works, but we've given up on it politically because it's too difficult. So my provocations for the question and answer session, just to finish, is given the reality of the situation, what do we actually do? How do we communicate what's possible within the bounds of a democratic society, and particularly in Europe and the US, democracies that are being increasingly challenged from the populist right, where even the assumption that we have a climate problem or that we should seek to rebalance mobility away from the car is under profound threat. Flip side of that is, how do we prepare policymakers in the system and the public by extension for the quite possible moment where some kind of acute crisis, whether it's the failure of very significant infrastructure or an extremely severe weather event that causes disruption or loss of life to a scale that becomes politically unacceptable? How do we avoid the mistakes of COVID and not, frankly, use the opportunity of that kind of event, macabre though that would be, to really change things? Because frankly, we haven't done it with COVID. We haven't changed our approach, not just to transport in the round, but not even to public health or many of the other really difficult areas of public policy that the COVID inquiries will tell us all about in due course. And finally, and this is one that really interests me from a research point of view, what if we were to admit that it's already too late? If we were to admit that actually we don't know how to fix the climate problem in the transport domain in time, what else could we focus on over the next 20 to 25 years that really would make life better and would at least provide a change from trying and failing to do the things we've tried and failed to do for the last 20, 30, 50 years?
Thank you very much indeed, Iain, and thanks you to all the panelists for your perspectives. So we've got quite a, if I may say, rather gloomy view of the challenges facing public policymakers and the difficulties that are faced in trying to achieve some of the objectives that have been set. I wonder if we can sort of start perhaps by, in terms of setting the questions off, by asking, and it's Pete Dyson has sent in this question: beyond the United Kingdom, which countries do the panelists feel are doing transport better, and specifically social science in transport? Can I ask which, Charles, Siobhan, any thoughts there about models of countries that we perhaps can look, public policymakers perhaps here can look to in terms of achieving a reduction in car dependency?
I don't think anyone's getting this right, and I think there is a real challenge that there is no kind of, oh right, kind of let's just follow them. I think there are some really good examples, and I think it's a bit of kind of mixing and matching. So Sweden are doing some really interesting things, again, around that gendered lens, and making sure that that's kind of part of policy making and decision making. Other places we all know about the Netherlands, but I think it's really interesting that they've got a huge cycling culture within the cities, but actually their per mile, my understanding is their per mile is equivalent to ours. So they're not actually reducing their car miles, but they are reducing it within. So it's kind of what is it you're trying to achieve, and be really clear about that. And that's why actually I think there's a local decision making is needed, so that you need to know kind of what works and what has worked and why has it worked. But equally, you need to know, what does this population we're trying to work with now, what are their issues? What other options have they got? I've recently moved from London to Glasgow, and actually I'm trying to cycle in Glasgow. It's not as easy as it is in London, and the weather's not as good. And so there are issues. I think you really need to understand what the local issues are and then do it. So I don't think there is kind of, they've got it cracked over there. But I think there are lots of good examples of individual initiatives that kind of you need to be learning from and bringing together, and there's a huge need to evaluate and to pilot to find out, actually, is this going to work here, because it might not.
And just that, I totally agree with that. And just adding to that, that it goes against this idea that you can just build it and people will come. You can't just create, I mean, it's part of the story to create the right infrastructure, but that's where social science is so important, because you can't just come up with an engineering solution and expect people to change their behavior as a result. It helps, but on its own, it doesn't make a difference. And that's why, I mean, even when you look at countries like the Netherlands and Denmark, which have higher cycling rates, but you know, it's taken years to get there, and a huge amount of a lot of different types of interventions that have been used to do that, from, you know, policy making, huge financial resources put into cycling and walking, as well as building infrastructure. You know, you can't just do one thing on its own. And I always like to think that we've got really progressive reducing car dominance policy in Wales. It's been really good under the Labour government in the last sort of 10 years or so. But in order to enact that properly takes a different kind of approach, and that's where we're up to at the moment. So almost like the policy is in place, but in order to make that happen, you need other strategies. And that is evident in trying to deliver the reduction in road building and also the 20-mile-an-hour default speed limit, which, although has come in, faces a huge backlash because, again, the social science hasn't quite been delivered in or quite understood in a way that would help the delivery of that.
Thank you, Charles. Iain, did you have any insights into where people are, which places are perhaps doing things well, or at least better to learn from?
First of all, to offer some furious agreement with what Siobhan and Charles have said. I mean, the Netherlands is a really interesting example, isn't it? So everybody immediately thinks it must surely be the best comparator we've got, but it's got the more of everything problem. So yes, it's got a lot more cycling, but it's got a lot more car use as well, and a lot more rail intensity. And interestingly, in a lot of places it's got less walking, but that's probably a question for the other day. So there's two things that come out of this discussion for me. Is that one is that lots of people like to latch on to little examples, but they're actually quite fallacious about what happens at a systems level. So, everybody thinks the Netherlands must be really great because there's lots of bikes. Well, do you know what's not true? And that's a real problem because we get very quickly into the kind of best practice fallacy, where if only we did that over here the same way as it's done over there, then we won't have the same problems. And you also see that, interestingly, in the debate about reducing road capacity. Because every time I hear about, isn't it great that Utrecht deconstructed a motorway through the city centre? Well, yeah, it was actually quite a small road, and by the way, one of Europe's busiest motorways is less than 2 kilometres away. So, the research base tells some difficult stories here, but one of the problems is that there's a big disconnect, I think, between what the research tells us and how that feeds through into public debate. And you can see that through low traffic neighbourhoods, can't you? Now that's worked out recently because we know they work. The research has told us that the negative externalities that lots of people said would come about from them really don't exist, but the public debate hasn't changed very much. And just finally on this, to pick up something that Siobhan said, or in the question about places or countries that have done things better. I think there is something in here about national governments being the wrong level to try and do a lot of this stuff. So if you look at places that really have changed what their mobility mix looks like, and have done that without the economic hit, they tend to be cities that are quite autonomous and have got the power to just go ahead and do it. But also they probably need to be, economically robust enough in the first place. And one of the great problems we've got in the UK is that our cities underperform economically by international standards quite significantly.
Thank you. That's a very shrewd point indeed, Iain, because I'm seeing some of the other questions here are related to at what sort of level of government do some of these solutions can some of these solutions be developed, and whether we need in the UK more local government funding in order to give cities that autonomy in terms of decision making that might be helpful. I know the current government seems to be quite focused on trying to reverse the problems that we've seen in cities outside of London. Does the panel perhaps have thoughts on how that might be achieved? I mean, is local decision making always better in terms of transport policy? What kind of things would you like to see? What do you think that the policymakers should be doing to drive this forward? Sorry, I think you're on, Charles.
Yeah, well, I was going to build on what Siobhan and I were talking about in terms of community involvement. I mean, if to do that properly costs a lot of money, and that's got to be done at a very local level. And we know from, transport research, and that's why it's difficult when we talk about the Netherlands and Denmark. And I think Iain's quite right about it, because it depends where you look at where the solutions happen. Some of them are very hyper local and made a big difference. Other ones can make, and then you try and move that into another location and it doesn't work at all. And that's why you need to take into account the local context and talk to the local community. And Siobhan said something really important, that becomes a two-way conversation then, so that people start understanding why, they can't drive their huge great big Toyota truck through somewhere outside of a school, because at the moment they just don't see that. They see it as a right to be able to do that, because that's how the system's allowed that to happen. So it becomes more of a conversation and more of a dialogue if you do it at a local level. So I'd really like to see local authorities be given a lot more power and a lot more resource to deliver what they need to do. But perhaps you have to have national policy and strategy to enable that and allow it to happen a bit more.
And just to build on that, I think there needs to be that consistency of message, and that's why I think you can't just have it local or just national. You need that consistency of message across all layers in order to kind of reinforce that message. And I think there's something really interesting as well about kind of the messenger and who it is that's delivering these messages, because the necessity to trust the message and the messenger, and to feel that any engagement in this kind of decision making is genuine and authentic and isn't tokenistic, because I think people can smell that a mile away. And so we need to make sure that we are engaging in an authentic way in order to do this, but it needs to be done at a system level and across all different aspects of that system.
Thank you. Siobhan, Iain, anything you wish to add?
Just to say really that, again, if you view this as a larger public policy problem, then this is about the extent to which cities are autonomous within their own region and their own economies. So the modern history of cities in the UK, so let's say 100 years, been dominated by suburbanisation and then limited attempts to re-densify and re-urbanise cities. So early on it was about housing and escaping the slums, then it became about education in many places, and now frankly it's about a car-dependent lifestyle. So we've developed a settlement pattern where most of the people that live in our city regions live in the suburbs, and they are intensely car-dependent places. And Outer London is the best example of that of all. I guess you look at the traffic and congestion levels in most of the Outer London boroughs, and they're pretty horrendous. And the political, or the current political prospect of anything approaching congestion charging or something equivalent for these places is pretty much zero, I would say. Again, to be positive though, I mean, we are going to have an opportunity here. So at some point before too long, we are going to have to address the question of how we pay to drive around. And see, I should declare an interest here, despite being a sustainable transport researcher. I actually quite like cars and driving too. Except I do understand that we sometimes have to not use them, and that other modes are better for some journeys. But to be serious again for a second, there's an assumption in the debate that congestion charging is still 10 years away, in the same way that it's been 10 years away for, what, 50 years now? So I think it will be 10 years away until one morning, and it might even be the current government, announces out of the blue that it's happening in 18 months' time. Because it can never be pre-announced properly. It'll have to be ready to go, and it will happen when the threat to Treasury income from the vehicle fleet, having moved quickly enough to non-fossil fuel vehicles, makes that the less worse option than doing nothing. But that's a massive opportunity for us to rethink who it is that pays for transport, because the price of driving drives, bad pun, the use of the public transport roads and active travel to a great extent. And that is the big opportunity coming in the medium term for us to think about how to make everything safer and greener and fairer.
Thank you, Iain. That's fascinating. I think perhaps there's something that can be learned from the way in which the London congestion zone was expanded initially to a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth, but actually Sadiq Khan has stuck with it, and it seems to, as time goes by, it's impressive how it increasingly comes to be accepted. But you raised on something very interesting about car dependency, and we've just got time for one or two more quick questions, which I see have been put in here. And one of those, from a social science point of view, is this association of car ownership and use with ideas such as freedom and autonomy. That's very powerful. Do we need to challenge that, and how might it be done?
For me, the car's been sold around freedom and independence, and therefore it's an aspirational. It appeals to people's aspirations, at least. And of course, that's mostly false. You're still bound by rules. You're still stuck behind queues of traffic. The freedom that you're sold is largely are pretty much false. It's a convenience you might have because we've designed our systems like it, but it's not the aspiration it's made out to be. We don't sell buses and public transport like that. We sell them on exactly what cars are actually, which is practical and convenience, and we worry about the cost of those kind of things. Whereas the car doesn't worry about any of those things. So there's a sort of perception problem at the end of the day that needs to be challenged and changed. You know, we've got to make mobility be the aspiration rather than cars per se. And there's a real opening or an opportunity for someone to sell the bus as being more sexy.
There's a challenge. Thank you, Charles. Siobhan, Iain, any thoughts?
I think this is really difficult because in reality, practically, mobility as a service, other ways of doing transport, there's a real opportunity to getting people. There's actually a much easier way of doing this than getting a car, but there is that emotional thing, and I think getting away from that emotional thing is really difficult. So I think we need to understand the emotional thing and then make sure we don't ignore it in terms of kind of our policy development, because overcoming that will be challenging. But I think the ease of use of the future options that are coming, especially in a densely urban area, will probably help this, that actually it's just easier to do. We know that young people are getting driving licenses later now, again, because they've got what they need, they don't need that. And so again, working with kind of where is it working, and let's kind of pushing forward with that. But I think the emotional aspect is always going to be challenging to overcome. The alternative needs to be so much better in order to overcome that.
Thank you, Iain.
Yeah, I mean, again, furious agreement. I mean, one thing I would say is that I think there is something to be learned from the history of smoking policy here. So if you went back 20 years ago and said, do you think it's possible in the UK that we'll have a ban on smoking in public places, and then that'll be extended to outdoor zones, and then we'll have what seems to be cross-party agreement on a smoke-free generation and the cessation of illegal sale of tobacco, people would have looked at you as if you were nuts. But yet, it looks like it might be about to happen. So for me, and I know this is really easy to say and really hard to deliver, it takes somebody with the political vision but the political security to take a couple of relatively minor but unpopular decisions that people in their heart or hearts know are correct. And I think in the transport sphere, we know what they are. So they're pricing. You know, so we still haven't done things that we could easily and should do, like non-residential parking taxes. You think about how many hundreds of thousands of free parking spaces there are at retail parks and supermarkets across the UK, every single one of which is undermining local town and city centres, for example. We know we should do something about that. Is it really too hard for one of the metropolitan mayors to say, do you know what, we're going to change this? And so I think we need to start with pricing gently and then ramp it up. And we need to hold our nerve on road space reallocation. So we need to keep going with low traffic neighbourhoods and the reallocation of space, particularly in city centres. And again, Charles, I was really struck by that picture of Cardiff and what we'd managed to achieve and then let slip through our fingers, because you can see that repeated all over the country. And again, you know, it doesn't have to be a big bang. We could do it on Sundays, then we could do it at weekends, then we could do it in July and August. And then all of a sudden people might think, why do we do that all the time?
Thank you. I'm sorry, so there have been a couple of very late questions come in, but I'm told that it is now 2 o'clock and we have to wrap up. But hopefully there'll be an opportunity somewhere to continue this discussion. I would like very much to thank Charles, Siobhan and Iain for their very thoughtful and insightful contributions, and also to all those of you who have attended. The recording of the session will be available in due course, I'm told, via the campaign's website. We want these sessions to prompt discussion beyond today, so please share thoughts through social media and friends and colleagues on some of the themes that have been raised. And if you've enjoyed today's webinar, then please do look at future events in this series and register to join us. Thank you very much indeed, all, and enjoy the rest of your day.